Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we have a really demanding exploration ahead of us. The source materials you sent over, they're intense. We're primarily looking at stevenwork's The Profil and Sickness, and then this really radical concept from John Carter called Homo Umbrans.
Right. And what's so challenging here is that this isn't your standard political commentary, not at all.
No, it's this comprehensive interlocking argument that says our modern decay. It isn't random. It's not economic. It's the direct psychological result of one single foundational moral compromise that was made decades ago.
That's the whole frame, isn't it? This is a deep dive that's forcing us to connect some very, very different fields. You have work, who starts with moral philosophy, even theology.
He brings in St. Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah, exactly. Aquinas and the wounds of sin to identify what he calls an injury to the soul. And then you have Carter, who takes that moral injury and, well, he diagnoses the creatures that results from it.
The Homo Umbrans, the shadow man.
The shadow man, being defined by a profound cognitive and linguistic collapse. It's a heavy-duty thesis.
So I guess our mission today is to trace that causal chain. We have to be meticulous here. We're going from the spiritual, the moral, through these huge legal changes, and then landing squarely in the fall. Modern psychology and how we talk to each other.
That's the path. We have to unpack how, according to these sources, one single accepted societal insanity could pave the way for this widespread loss of rational thought, this destruction of language itself.
So the core claim we're wrestling with is that we're actually witnessing the emergence of a non-sapient human state. Is that fair to say?
That is precisely Carter's term. And he argues it's driven by a state-enforced insanity acceptance. Process that began crucially with the inversion of life and death way back in the early 1970s.
And for them, that wasn't just a political loss. It was something deeper.
It was the moment, they claimed. The state demanded that the entire population internalize an objective falsehood, a biological and moral lie. And in doing so, it fundamentally crippled the collective's ability to recognize truth.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start at the beginning then. Part one was stevenwork and his thesis on the profound sickness. Work's claim is just. It's absolutely definitive, isn't it? He argues that the societal acceptance of abortion is the catalyst.
Yes. For him, this isn't a legal issue. It's not medical. It is a fundamental moral, intellectual, and even spiritual illness that has led society, in his words, into a fall into hell.
He really doesn't pull any punches.
No. He sees the normalization of abortion as the ultimate unforgivable compromise. For him, the legalization, especially post-1973, that's the pivotal moment.
And he frames it in some pretty extreme language. I mean, he calls it a public announcement that Satan rules the federal government.
He does, which for him signals this explicit, organized moral inversion. And he claims it's carried out by what he calls the synagogue of Satan and its minions. We're just reporting his framework here, but it's a spiritual warfare model.
That's a very radical way to interpret legal history, to put it mildly. So how does he explain the mechanism? How does one legal decision inflict a wound on the collective soul, not just an individual one?
Well, this is where he brings in that historical and theological anchor we mentioned, St. Thomas Aquinas. Work uses the doctrine of the wounds of sin.
Okay.
The basic premise is that habitual vice, in this case, the state sanctioning the habituation to this vice, inflicts severe systemic damage on our core human faculties. Things like our intellect, our judgment, our capacity for prudence, charity.
So by normalizing it, society is forced into this chronic state of moral compromise.
Exactly. And those faculties, they just begin to erode. They start to weaken.
This link between ancient theology and modern pathology is really the core of their argument, isn't it? We should probably spend some real time breaking down these four specific wounds he talks about. The sources draw a very clear parallel between the theological idea and its modern psychological manifestation.
Let's do it. The first one, and you could argue it's the most important for what comes later, is ignorance. Now, for Aquinas, this means a darkening of the intellect.
So not just not knowing things.
No, it's not a lack of data. It's the profound loss of moral discernment. The light of reason, in a way, gets dimmed. Work then connects this directly with modern psychological concepts, cognitive distortion, and, maybe more importantly, schema entrenchment.
Schema entrenchment. Let's dig into that.
Yeah.
For someone listening who's smart but maybe not a psychology expert, how does that foundational lie become a kind of psychological wall?
Okay, so think of it like this. When a society is basically forced to accept something that's a manifest falsehood like, say, defining a developing human life as not a person or just a clump of fells, the mind has to do something to resolve that conflict. It has to build an elaborate, protective mental structure, a schema, to justify the falsehood.
It's a defense mechanism.
It's a defense mechanism to protect the individual from cognitive dissonance, that schema entrenchment. And once that schema is built, it's like a filter, a very powerful filter. Any new evidence, any moral argument, any biological fact that contradicts that original lie, it gets automatically dismissed.
Or distorted.
Or distorted, or maybe just labeled as hate speech or something to shut it down.
So the mind isn't just disagreeing on a moral point anymore, it's actively preventing itself from even processing a moral truth because its whole internal architecture is now built around the necessity of that original lie.
You've got it. That explains what work calls this pervasive moral blindness. If your foundational concept of life and personhood is based on a lie, then your intellect's ability to process any subsequent complex moral or political reality is already compromised.
The light you need for moral discernment it's basically been switched off.
It's extinguished. And that right there is the wound of ignorance.
Okay, so let's move to the second wound then. Malice, the corruption of the will. Theologically, that means our inclination towards genuine good is weakened. How does work connect this to measurable modern psychological traits?
He links malice to the emergence of what psychologists call callous unemotional traits and also reactive aggression. When the will is corrupted, your motivation shifts away from the true good things like preserving life or the good of the community, and it moves towards self-serving or even destructive goals.
Which are then justified through that schema we just talked about.
They have to be. This is why, work argues, we see such a distortion of the concept of love. Love stops being about self-giving and it becomes possessive or conditional. It's a love that often justifies destructive acts in the name of autonomy or choice.
So the capacity to really choose the good is replaced by, what, a hardened inclination to just choose what's convenient.
Exactly. And this really explains the source's later critique of desensitization. They point out how a moral horror in 1972 gets this huge global outrage. But a similar horror today is met with what they call a screaming silence.
Because the will to respond to true suffering has been corrupted. It's been worn down by these earlier, smaller, more routine cruelties.
That is the essential link for work. He argues that if you habituate a society to ignore the suffering of the most vulnerable life, the life inside the womb, then the will becomes systematically less inclined to act against suffering outside the womb. It's a training process.
And it manifests as indifference.
Indifference, which is, psychologically speaking, callous, unemotional behavior on a mass scale.
All right, the third wound is weakness, the inability to resist temptation or coercion. What's the modern psychological parallel for that one?
So theologically, weakness means you become more prone to future sins because your virtue, your moral strength has been diminished. In our modern context, work aligns this with learned helplessness and a profoundly impaired sense of agency.
How so?
Well, the argument is that if the state or the cultural establishment can successfully coerce millions of people into accepting a foundational lie, it breaks their moral resolve. It breaks their agency. They learn that resistance is either futile or just too socially costly.
And this learned helplessness is crucial, isn't it? It seems to set the stage for the later emergence of Homo Umbrans because it preconditions the population for whatever the next state-imposed delusion is.
Absolutely. It's a critical step. If you are vulnerable to coercion, you become a perfect subject for control. Work argues that this impaired agency makes the population extremely susceptible to subsequent, wider manipulation.
Like the linguistic inversions Carter is going to talk about later.
Precisely. People become intellectually weak, morally pliable. It paves the way for all the other forms of moral decay, because the strength to simply say, no, that's not true, has been compromised at a very deep level.
And that brings us to the final wound, which seems like the most visible one. Concupiscence or disordered desire.
Yes, this is maybe the most explicit connection to contemporary society. Theologically, it just means our desires become untethered from their proper natural purpose. Work sees this manifesting everywhere as hedonic dysregulation, impulsivity, and addiction.
And he links it specifically to sexuality.
He does. He points to the prioritization of sexual desire, which the sources argue is intrinsically linked to procreation over the very life that is created by that desire.
Let's focus on that term, hedonic dysregulation. How does the moral compromise translate into that specific psychological state?
Hedonic dysregulation is basically the breakdown of the brain's ability to properly regulate pleasure and motivation. So, by rationalizing what the source calls a grave evil as a right, the convenience of terminating a life for the sake of lifestyle or sexual freedom, The individual is prioritizing an immediate disordered desire, or hedonism, over a profound objective good, which is life itself.
So that act habituates the mind to vice.
It creates a positive feedback loop, it rewards impulsive behavior, and it systematically disorders all your other desires. Everything becomes subservient to immediate gratification. According to Work, this just accelerates the societal fall.
Okay, so to sum up this first part, the sources are arguing that the societal acceptance of abortion created a generation whose intellect is warped by these entrenched lies, whose will is hardened by malice and indifference, and whose desires are profoundly disordered.
Yes. And this cumulative generational damage is what Work calls the profo in sickness. And that damage, according to his thesis, is the necessary soil. It's the fertile ground for the cognitive collapse that we're going to see later with Carter.
The capacity for truth and rational order just diminishes with each generation born into this environment of compulsory assent to falsehoods.
That's the core of his argument.
Okay, here's where it gets, I think, really interesting. If Work's thesis is correct, that this foundational sickness has been taking root since the 1970s, then the symptoms should be everywhere. They should be overwhelmingly visible in our culture, in our institutions.
And the sources point to very specific societal shifts as evidence. They start with what we touched on before, the desensitization to suffering.
Right. This is one of the most powerful points in the material, that contrast between two eras of public reaction.
It's a stark contrast. Work points to the massive global outrage that was ignited by that 1972 photograph of Kim Phuc, the napalm-burned Vietnamese girl. That single image fueled anti-war sentiment around the world. It was seen as an intolerable moral horror by a society that, according to Work, was still relatively sane.
And now you contrast that immediate gut-wrenching response with today, where we have graphic, immediate, readily available video of mass killings and intense suffering, say, from a conflict in Gaza or other hotspots.
And it's often met with this peculiar detachment, what the source calls a screaming silence and little outrage, even when these events involve nations directly connected to or funded by Western powers.
Work sees this difference as a chilling indicator of widespread damage to mind-soul.
The mechanism here, he would argue, is that wound of malice, the callous, unemotional traits, combined with the wound of ignorance, the moral blindness. If your mind has already built a schema to tolerate the systematic elimination of human life internally, via abortion, then your capacity for fundamental empathy towards human life externally is severely degraded.
The shock of horror is just muted.
It's muted.
Yeah.
The capacity for a public, unified moral outcry is basically lost.
So this desensitization isn't just because we're saturated with media, it's a symptom of a much deeper moral injury.
That's the claim.
Yeah.
And they extend this critique directly to the structure of the family, citing no-fault divorce as another critical symptom of the sickness.
And this is connected to those other wounds, concupiscence and weakness.
Yes. The sources view no-fault divorce as deeply destructive. They assert that it allows for the dissolution of families often at the unilateral whim of just one spouse. This, they argue, is evidence of a society that now prioritizes immediate adult desire, that's the concupiscence and hedonic dysregulation, over the stability of the most foundational social unit, the family.
And the deeper critique is really about the disregard for the children's well-being in all of this.
Absolutely. The source is highly critical of the system for, in its view, disregarding the good of the children. They cite extensive studies, though they don't specify which ones, showing that children have significantly better life outcomes with an involved biological father, even in the absence of the mother.
Yet custody decisions, they argue, remain disproportionately awarded to mothers.
Right. Often based on what they see as outdated legal presumptions rather than empirical data on child welfare. This structural bias is presented as evidence of a systemic moral sickness that elevates adult convenience over the proven needs of the next generation.
This alleged sickness also seems to surface in these legal and philosophical inconsistencies, which the sources just flat out label as profound insanity. Let's look at the legal inversion they talk about regarding personhood.
This is a big one for them. They highlight what they see as this radical, irreconcilable contradiction in Western law. On one hand, the legal framework explicitly denies personhood rights to the unborn, which is, a self-evidently biological human life.
Right.
But then on the other hand, the very same legal systems grant extensive, complex, and often very powerful personhood rights to abstract corporate entities. Legal fictions that are created purely for financial and economic purposes.
So this is framed as prioritizing artificial economic constructs over vulnerable, actual human life.
Precisely. This inversion is seen as a symptom of that wounded intellect, the wound of ignorance. The legal system is forced to accept this deep structural lie, that a piece of property or a legal fiction can be a person, but an actual human life cannot. It's a profound legal and moral disconnect for them.
It shows a systemic prioritizing of material wealth over the sanctity of life.
That's the argument. Now, we have to confront the argument the sources deploy against the claim of absolute bodily autonomy, which is really the cornerstone of the pro-choice position. This is where they bring in that analogy about military conscription.
Right. This is a very provocative comparison.
It is. It's designed to directly challenge the ethical premise of absolute autonomy. The sources argue that sexual relations are a conscious exercise of bodily autonomy, yes, but that act inherently carries the biological and moral potential of creating life. Therefore, by engaging in that consensual act, autonomy is implicitly ceded regarding the consequences.
The choice to initiate the activity carries the obligation for the natural result.
That's the logic. And the conscription parallel is used to argue that if society can override personal autonomy for a perceived collective good, it can do so here as well.
So walk us through that logic.
Okay, the argument proceeds like this. Society can, and does, morally impose military conscription on men. It requires them to surrender years of their lives, risk death, potentially kill others, all for the perceived good and security of the nation. If that sacrifice and that forced surrender of bodily autonomy is deemed acceptable,
then logically, society can require a woman to carry a pregnancy to term.
To carry a pregnancy to term resulting from a consensual act for the greater moral good of protecting a vulnerable life. That's the parallel they draw.
And the sources are explicitly condemning the idea that sexual gratification is a right for women and killing the life she may create is acceptable.
They condemn it as insane. They argue that it elevates a disordered desire concupiscence to the status of a protected right while dismissing the fundamental right to life, which they see as the true foundation of any sane society.
So it's an internal contradiction that, to them, proves how pervasive the sickness is.
Yes. And beyond these core arguments, the sources cite a whole array of other societal ills that they see as escalating evidence of this sickness, all reflecting a society moving toward a culture of death.
Like what?
Well, they mention the systematic impoverishment of the citizenry and the loss of meaningful political speech, which they allege has been transferred to corporate demonic forms, meaning these unaccountable institutions that prioritize profit and control over any kind of democratic accountability. This reflects that triumph of material desire over democratic reason.
And the crisis we see around sexuality and identity is viewed as an inevitable escalation of that initial compromise.
Exactly. Once the foundational lie about life is accepted, it becomes much easier to accept lies about human nature itself. They cite the normalization of what they call sexual mutilations of psychologically damaged people, referring to gender-affirming surgeries, and the alleged sexual grooming of young children in public schools.
So for the sources, these aren't separate progressive issues.
No, they are direct, logical extensions of the initial moral compromise that allowed disordered desire to start dictating reality.
And the final act of this moral sickness, according to the sources, is the embrace of euthanasia.
Yes. The acceptance of euthanasia, especially for reasons like depression or similar whims, is presented as the final surrender of the will. It shows a complete devaluation of life itself and the ultimate triumph of both weakness and malice. It's the society actively choosing death over enduring or addressing suffering. It cements the culture of death.
Now, before we move on to the cognitive diagnosis, we have to address the highly charged claims that work makes about the underlying cause of all this, the spiritual war. We need to report these claims impartially as the framework that's guiding the source material.
It is absolutely essential to understand this part of his argument. Work views the sickness not just as social decline, but as a literal satanic war orchestrated by a demonic director. This war, he argues, is prosecuted through global power structures, what he calls the synagogue of Satan, which employ minions.
And he names specific groups?
He does. He includes perceived Zionists, modernists, and Freemasons among these minions, who he claims have infiltrated and corrupted all major institutions. Governments, churches, media, everything.
And this includes a very specific and deeply controversial claim about the role of women in this conflict. This is integral to his idea of societal decay.
It is. And we need to be very precise here. Work claims that these malevolent forces are actively promoting female evil and man-hating, specifically to destroy the traditional family unit. He concludes with an extreme, highly charged statement that we must report verbatim as his view. He states that women have become the synagogue of Satan minions, fifth column, destructive, mind-crippled, programmed golem army found in all families and throughout all significant institutions.
That is an incredibly strong claim.
It is. And it explicitly ties the moral wound abortion and family dissolution to a perceived spiritual conspiracy aimed at using women as agents of total societal destruction. Again, we are reporting this as the explicit, non-negotiable framework of Work's thesis.
Okay, so having examined Work's moral and spiritual diagnosis, let's now shift our focus to the observable cognitive results of this sickness. This is where John Carter comes in. If Work describes the wound, Carter provides the terminal diagnosis, the emergence of the shadow man.
Yes, Carter's essay, Homo Umbrans, it shifts the analytical lens entirely. He argues that the cumulative moral sickness that Work described has led to a catastrophic linguistic and cognitive collapse. The result is a species that he claims is no longer truly sapient. He defines Homo Umbrans as the shadow man.
What's the key psychological distinction for Carter between Homo sapiens and Homo Umbrans?
Well, Homo sapiens possesses sapience. That's the capacity for self-awareness, for reflection, abstract reason, and maybe most crucially, metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking.
Right.
The Homo Umbrans, the shadow man, has lost this. They're reduced to unreflective, instinctual, programmed reactions. They can mimic human behavior, they hold jobs, they use phones, they have social interactions, but they lack that internal light of self-awareness.
Carter likens them to an NPC in a video game.
He does. An NPC running on predetermined ideological scripts, with no capacity for genuine self-correction or even for recognizing contradiction in themselves.
So what's the primary observable mechanism that he says led to this state?
Carter's central argument is that linguistic corruption is the direct cause of cognitive collapse. We think in language. Coherent thought, memory, reflection, they all require stable, objective language. If you systematically corrupt the meaning of core ethical and political words, you destroy the very tools of reason.
And without those tools,
Metacognition becomes impossible, and the shadow man emerges. The woke mind virus, as it's sometimes called, is thus viewed as a spiritual and cognitive annihilation that's achieved through the destruction of language.
the sources cite this powerful, concrete example that highlights this loss of self-awareness, the human water fountain woman. Let's dissect that anecdote because it's presented as the prime example of the Homo Umbrans in action.
Right. This was an Australian mental health worker who publicly celebrated the potential violent death of a political opponent. She posted some incredibly aggressive content online. But what makes this a perfect example for Carter is her reaction when she faced consequences for it.
What happened?
When her professional livelihood was threatened, she completely reversed course. She immediately started appealing to the very same free speech arguments that her ideological cohort had spent years working to dismantle and label as a form of violence.
So her mind demonstrated a complete internal disconnect.
A profound void. Carter argues she demonstrated absolutely no memory or recognition of her own personal hypocrisy. The Homo Umbrans cannot connect their past actions with their present predicaments because the stable internal reality needed for that connection is just gone.
She was just running one script, ideological rage, and then instantly switched to another, self-preservation via free speech, without any awareness of the contradiction.
None at all. And that failure of metacognition is the critical hallmark of the shadow man. It's not just a person being hypocritical. It's the inability of the mind to even register the hypocrisy.
That connects back perfectly to Work's foundational wound of ignorance, doesn't it? The darkening of the intellect.
It's the perfect manifestation. The schema that was built around the original lie prevents the shadow man from recognizing any subsequent smaller lie, even when that lie is their own contradictory behavior. They are just compelled to assent to whatever the current ideological demand is, regardless of their own history.
Let's get into the details of the systemic inversion of language. Carter identifies his modern newspeak. This is the weapon he says is used to maintain this non-sapient state.
Okay. Carter lists these inversions as deliberate tactics. They're designed to erase rational discourse by making words mean their exact opposite. And this goes way beyond simple political spin. When these terms are inverted, it compels the population to assent to a public falsehood, which is a key component of psychological control.
Give us some examples.
So, hate gets redefined as love of one's own. So any defense of your own culture, your family, your nation, is now branded as ideological hatred.
Right.
Social justice is inverted to become anti-social injustice, a system that elevates identity grievance over universal fairness. The concepts of speech and violence are completely inverted. Speech becomes violence if it causes emotional discomfort, while actual physical destruction, violence, is redefined as speech or a justifiable means of achieving political ends.
I see.
And it goes on. Democracy is corrupted into rule by the diktat of unaccountable bureaucrats. Progress is redefined as decay, where you're actively dismantling civilizational achievements. And maybe the most common one, tolerance, is inverted into forced celebration. You're not just required to tolerate a difference, you must actively endorse and celebrate it, or you're a bigot.
So when these fundamental terms are inverted like this, the very foundation of objective reality is compromised. You can't even argue about facts anymore because the language you would need to frame the argument has been completely destroyed.
It creates an environment where society is perpetually humiliated by being forced to assent to these manifest falsehoods. And this compulsion fosters a self-inflicted moral corruption, which is the perfect fuel for the Homo Umbrans.
So the shadow man is formed not just by external lies,
but by the internal choice to participate in the lie. And that transition brings us to, I think, the most insightful element of all this material. The explicit synthesis of Work's moral framework and Carter's cognitive diagnosis. They argue these two things, the moral wound and the linguistic virus, are intrinsically linked, a sequence of cause and effect.
Right. So what does this all mean when we combine the two?
It means that the moral compromise of Work's thesis, that state-sanctioned lie about life, was the necessary original infection. It enabled the systemic linguistic corruption that Carter describes.
The spiritual and moral failure paved the way for the cognitive failure.
Precisely. Work's original wound, the societal acceptance of abortion, is identified as the primary instance of a state-imposed delusion. It was the original test case for Newspeak. The redefinition of words like life, personhood, and choice in the wake of 1973, that was the foundational linguistic inversion. It was the template on which all the subsequent inversions were built.
So how did that one initial act of linguistic corruption, how did it habituate the entire population to this process of self-deception?
Well, by compelling assent to the fundamental falsehood, that the intentional termination of a developing human life is morally neutral or even good, the state forced individuals to build that protective schema we talked about, rooted in ignorance.
The schema that required them to suppress objective biological reality.
Yes. And once the mind agreed to suppress the reality of life in the womb, it learned how to suppress reality everywhere else. The state, in effect, successfully trained the public mind in the process of reality inversion.
This is the mechanism by which the individual's cognitive immune system was weakened, making them susceptible to the wider woke mind virus.
That analogy is central to their synthesis. Think of the cognitive immune system as the integrated capacity of your intellect and your will to reject falsehoods and choose the good. If you weaken that system by forcing it to internalize a profound lie about human nature, it loses its ability to fight off subsequent lesser lies.
So a populace trained to redefine the biological reality of life in the womb is basically preconditioned to accept all these other wider linguistic distortions.
Absolutely. For instance, if you accept that a biological human entity is not a person because it's inconvenient, then accepting that a man can be a woman or that political speech is violence, well, it becomes relatively easy.
You're intellectually defenseless at that point.
You are. The subsequent lies, the linguistic inversions about gender or justice or violence, they're far less biologically obvious than the lie about life itself. If the mind swallowed that profound foundational lie, it will surely swallow the less profound, though still destructive, lies about identity and speech.
So the first lie created the vulnerability.
It did. And this connection establishes that causal link they're so focused on. The path to Homo Umbrans did not begin with the inversion of political terms in the 2010s. It began with the state-sanctioned inversion of life and death decades prior.
This synthesis suggests that the problem isn't just a political battle of ideas, then. It's a deep spiritual and cognitive injury that has to be addressed at its root.
That is their ultimate conclusion. The state demanded that individuals internalize an objective moral falsehood. And that single act, leveraging the Thomistic framework of wounding the intellect, crippled the soul's ability to resist all subsequent wider lies. To undo the damage, the process of truth must begin at that same foundational level. The cure has to be as radical as the initial infection.
Okay, so if the diagnosis is a society that is deeply oriented away from objective reality and towards self-deception, then the solution has to be a radical realignment with truth. John Carter advocates for a multifaceted strategy for recovery that moves way beyond just winning elections.
Right. Strategy 1 is the foundation for everything else. Reorient towards reality. Carter insists this has to be the central guiding principle. It has to be prioritized above ideology, above policy, even above political victory.
A sane society must be built upon alignment with truth and objective reality.
Yes, distinguishing it fundamentally from an ideology built on what he calls a tapestry of lies. This is the only way, he argues, to begin healing that wounded intellect.
Strategy 2, though, is probably the most controversial part of the prescribed solution: the advocacy for strategic ruthlessness and right-wing cancel squads. Now, that sounds dangerously close to the very tactics they condemn. How do the sources justify this approach?
Carter justifies this not as an act of vengeance, but as a necessary and surgical act of civilizational self-preservation. He argues that the system is currently infected by individuals, the Homo Umbrans, who are demonstrably unfit to hold positions of critical public trust because they lack metacognition, moral clarity, and self-awareness.
He goes back to the example of the medical professional who celebrated violence.
Exactly. Can you trust such a person with the care of vulnerable patients? His answer is no. So the goal is to excise rot by removing those who actively incite madness and confusion, based not on their political affiliation, but on their demonstrated disconnect from reality and the social contract.
So it's presented as a defensive action to protect the fundamental fabric of reality and competence.
Yes. Carter argues that failing to remove these compromised individuals, the ones who demonstrate a complete failure of the rational faculties that work described, is itself a profound moral failure that just allows the sickness to keep propagating. The ruthlessness is strategic, aimed only at restoring functional competence and moral sobriety to our institutions.
But this has to be balanced by strategy 3, offering forgiveness and magnanimity to the redeemable.
This is a crucial distinction for him. Carter explicitly contrasts this approach with the ideological systems he critiques, which he labels the Church of No Salvation, a system that perpetually punishes past deviations and offers no true path back. He insists on magnanimity for those who show genuine contrition.
And how is that defined?
It's defined as a radical turning back toward objective reality and truth. The argument is that many people are not inherently malicious. They were merely deluded by a lifetime of systemic lies.
They were victims of the linguistic virus, not necessarily its malicious perpetrators.
That's the idea. The sources cite figures who have shown signs of breaking with ideological orthodoxy, people like Schoenhead or Ken Geiger or Ezra Klein, as examples of people who should be welcomed back if they demonstrate a genuine and durable reorientation toward truth. The goal is recovery for the majority, not permanent exile for everyone who ever slipped into the ideological mire.
Ultimately, the sources frame this act of draining the swamp, exiling those who incite madness, as a profoundly therapeutic measure.
That is the key analytical point. By clearing the toxic, confusing environment, you are eliminating the source of the cognitive pollution. This act allows the light of truth to re-enter, and it gives the vast lost majority of people who were merely coerced or deluded the chance to begin the healing process, to reclaim their humanity, and to restore their corrupted moral and cognitive faculties.
The external environment has to be sanitized so the internal recovery can even begin.
That's the strategy. So to summarize this very intensive deep dive, the sources provided offer a comprehensive, though certainly polarizing, framework. It directly connects moral decay to cognitive failure.
Right. Work's analysis established that the acceptance of a foundational moral wound decades ago, that inversion of life and death, created the necessary moral habituation for this widespread societal sickness.
And that sickness, he argues, directly led to Carter's terminal diagnosis: the pervasive cognitive failure, the loss of self-awareness, and the linguistic corruption embodied by the Homo Umbrans.
So the conclusion is that the state-sanctioned lie about the nature of life itself was the original infection. It's what made the collective mind susceptible to all the subsequent wider linguistic and moral viruses.
And according to these sources, the solution can't be merely political negotiation or policy modification. It has to be a spiritual and cognitive reawakening, a courageous and unflinching restoration of objective truth to the public square.
The path to a cure, therefore, involves reversing the very process that manufactured the shadow man. If the destruction of language annihilated the soul by compelling us to assent to falsehoods,
then restoration has to begin with a foundational, uncompromising truth that rejects that original state-sanctioned delusion.
So we'll leave you with this final provocative thought, which comes straight from the heart of this source material. The analysis suggests that the first lie makes all subsequent lies easier to swallow. If the linguistic annihilation of the soul is achieved through compulsory assent to falsehoods, what small, immediate, and simple act of speaking an uncomfortable truth, one that directly reverses a state-sanctioned lie or a commonly accepted inversion, might best begin the restoration of sapience, even if it carries immediate social consequences? This, the sources suggest, is the light capable of dispelling the metaphysical darkness. We urge you to consider what that first act of alignment with reality might be for you.